The photograph never changed. 6 boys in choir robes, smiling on the steps of St. Godfrey's Cathedral, unaware they would vanish within hours of the shutter's click. For 28 years, it haunted Ruth Carraway, the church organist who'd noticed young Daniel's fear that Sunday morning but did nothing. The town moved on, the church dwindled, and Ruth aged at her keyboard, playing hymns for ghosts. Then came the note, yellowed and desperate, tucked in a forgotten hymnal. "We're still down here. Please help us. D." 6 boys had disappeared, without a trace. But what if, beneath the sacred ground, someone was still breathing, still listening to the music that filtered through stone, still waiting to be found? Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Godfrey's Cathedral, casting prismatic patterns across the worn wooden pews. 6 boys in crisp white surplices and red cassocks gathered around the choir director, their voices rising in harmony as they practiced for Sunday's service. St. Godfrey's stood as an imposing Gothic structure in the heart of Millfield, a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone, and the church served as both spiritual anchor and social hub. "Higher on that last note, Daniel," instructed Mrs. Fletcher, the choir director. "Let it soar to the rafters." Daniel Matthews, 14 and the oldest of the group, nodded solemnly. His voice cracked slightly as he reached for the note, causing the younger boys to stifle their giggles. "It's not funny," Daniel muttered, his cheeks flushing. "My voice is changing." "We know," teased Michael Winters, a freckle-faced 12-year-old. "Pretty soon you'll sound like Father Wendell." Father Wendell Harrison, who had been observing from the sidelines, stepped forward with a gentle smile. At 48, he cut an impressive figure in his clerical collar and dark suit, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed back. "There's nothing wrong with a man's voice, Michael," he said warmly. "Daniel's just growing up. You'll be there soon enough." The practice continued under the watchful eye of Ruth Carraway, the church organist. At 35, Ruth was a quiet, observant woman who had played at St. Godfrey's for nearly a decade. Her fingers danced across the keys as the boys' voices filled the cathedral, but her attention was drawn repeatedly to Daniel. Something seemed off about him today, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy she couldn't quite place. "Let's take 5 minutes," Mrs. Fletcher announced. "Then we'll run through Amazing Grace one more time before the photographer arrives." As the boys scattered, Ruth approached Daniel, who stood alone by a pillar, staring at the floor. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up, startled. "Yes, Ms. Carraway, just thinking." "About the service?" "No, just stuff." He shrugged, but his eyes darted toward Father Wendell, who was speaking in hushed tones with Bishop Lawrence near the altar. Ruth followed his gaze. "Is there something—" "It's nothing," Daniel interrupted. "I should get some water before we start again." He hurried away, leaving Ruth with an uneasy feeling she couldn't shake. The photographer arrived precisely at noon. Mr. Bellows, a portly man with a balding head and perpetual smile, herded the 6 boys into position on the choir steps. Besides Daniel and Michael, there was 11-year-old Tommy Walker, the twins James and Robert Parker, both 10, and 12-year-old Andrew Davis. "Smile, boys," Mr. Bellows called out. "This is for the parish newsletter." The flash popped, capturing their young faces in a moment of innocence. None of them knew it would become the most recognized image in town. The last photograph of the 6 boys together, beaming in their choir robes before vanishing into thin air. The Sunday service proceeded. As usual, the cathedral filled with the faithful of Millfield. Ruth played the organ, her fingers moving automatically while her mind drifted to Daniel's strange behavior. During the processional hymn, she noticed him glancing repeatedly toward the north transept, where a small wooden door led to the vestry. Father Wendell's sermon focused on faith during trials. "Even in darkness, God hears our prayers," he intoned, his resonant voice filling the space. At communion, Ruth watched the 6 choir boys file down from their stalls to receive the sacrament. As Daniel knelt at the altar rail, Father Wendell whispered something in his ear that made the boys' shoulders stiffen. The service concluded at 11:45 a.m., The congregation filed out, chatting in the crisp autumn air, while the choir boys remained behind to change out of their robes. Ruth packed up her sheet music, nodding goodbye to Mrs. Fletcher, who had a standing lunch date with her husband. "The boys did wonderfully today," Ruth commented to Father Wendell as he passed. "Indeed, they did," he agreed, his expression unreadable. "Their voices are truly God's instruments." Ruth left through the side door at 12:10, noting that the boys hadn't emerged yet. Not unusual, as they often took time changing and joking around in the choir room. Parents typically waited in cars outside or picked their sons up at the parish hall, where coffee and donuts were served after Mass. By 12:30, confusion had settled over the crowd outside. Alice Matthews, Daniel's mother, approached Ruth, who had lingered to chat with parishioners. "Have you seen the boys?" she asked, concern etching lines in her forehead. "Daniel should have been out by now." Ruth frowned. "They were changing after the service. Maybe they're still in the choir room?" More parents gathered, worry spreading, like ripples in a pond. Father Wendell emerged from the sacristy, his face the picture of calm. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked. "Our sons," Mrs. Walker said anxiously. "They haven't come out." Father Wendell's brow furrowed. "I'll check. The choir room." He disappeared back into the church, returning minutes later with a puzzled expression. "They're not there. Their street clothes are still laid out, but no sign of the boys." Panic began to spread. Parents rushed into the church, calling their sons' names. The cathedral's vast interior swallowed their voices, returning only hollow echoes. By 1 p.m., a systematic search was underway. Every corner of the cathedral was examined: the sacristy, the crypts, the bell tower, even the confessionals. Bishop Lawrence arrived, his face grave as he conferred with Father Wendell. "What about the lower level?" Ruth suggested, remembering old stories. "The catacombs?" Father Wendell dismissed the idea with a wave. "Those are just stories, Ruth. There's nothing below but old storage rooms, and those have been checked." By 2 p.m., police officers filled the cathedral. Officer Reynolds, a heavy-set man with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, took statements from everyone. "So nobody saw these boys leave?" he asked incredulously. 6 kids don't just vanish into thin air." As daylight faded, so did hope. Search parties combed the surrounding woods and neighborhoods. Dogs sniffed choir robes for scents, but lost all trails at the church doors. It was as if the boys had simply ceased to exist the moment the final hymn ended. Ruth sat alone in the empty cathedral late that night, her fingers resting on the silent organ keys. The echo of the boys' voices seemed to linger in the air, especially Daniel's, clear and pure, rising above the others. "I should have asked more questions," she whispered to the darkness. "I knew something was wrong." The days became weeks, the weeks months. The search continued but gradually lost momentum. Theories abounded: kidnapping, runaways, even alien abduction according to the town eccentric. But no evidence emerged. No ransom demands, no sightings. The church instituted new safety measures. Children were never left unsupervised. Background checks became mandatory for all staff. But attendance dwindled as parents kept their children close, the tragedy casting a long shadow over St. Godfrey's. Ruth stayed on as organist, feeling somehow responsible, as if her music might someday call the boys home. Father Wendell was eventually transferred to another parish, replaced by younger priests who didn't carry the weight of that terrible Sunday. The case remained open, but inactive. 6 empty graves with 6 headstones stood in the cemetery, memorial markers for bodies never found. 28 years passed, time dulling the sharp edges of grief into a persistent ache. Ruth's auburn hair had turned silver, her hands slightly gnarled with arthritis but still nimble on the organ keys. In May 2008, a young reporter named Lisa Thornton approached Ruth after Sunday service. "Ms. Carraway, I'm doing a piece for the 28th anniversary of the missing choir boys. Would you be willing to share your memories?" Ruth sighed, feeling the weight of nearly 3 decades of questions without answers. "I've said everything there is to say." "You were one of the last people to see them," Lisa persisted, "and you've stayed all these years. There must be a reason." Ruth looked up at the vast ceiling of St. Godfrey's, now more tourist attraction than thriving parish. I suppose I'm still listening, she said softly. Just in case they try to come home. The cathedral stood like a sentinel against the modern landscape of Millfield. While strip malls and coffee chains had sprung up around it, St. Godfrey's remained steadfastly unchanged, its stone facade weathered by time, but unbending. Much like Ruth herself. Sunday's congregation filled barely half the pews, a stark contrast to the packed services of decades past. The boy's disappearance had marked the beginning of a slow decline, though tourists still came to see the infamous cathedral where 6 children had vanished without a trace. Ruth's interview with Lisa Thornton had stirred memories better left undisturbed. Sleep had eluded her for days afterward, her dreams filled with echoes of children's voices and the image of Daniel's troubled face that final morning. On Wednesday afternoon, Ruth practiced for the upcoming service, her fingers moving automatically through Bach's prelude in G minor. The empty cathedral amplified each note, filling the space with sound that seemed to reach into every shadow. When she finished, Ruth began organizing the sheet music, pulling out several hymnals that hadn't been used in years. As she opened a dusty copy of Hymns of Glory, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Ruth picked it up, thinking it was just a forgotten bookmark, but when she unfolded it, her heart nearly stopped. The paper was yellowed with age, the pencil marks faded but still legible. In childish handwriting were 7 words. We're still down here. Please help us. D. Her hands trembled as she stared at the note. D. Daniel? Impossible. The paper looked decades old. But how could it have remained undiscovered all this time? A prank, she muttered, anger rising at such cruelty. But something about the handwriting tugged at her memory. Ruth drove straight to the home of Alice Matthews, Daniel's mother. Now in her 70s, Alice lived alone in the same house where she had raised her son, his bedroom preserved like a shrine. Ruth, Alice said, surprised to see the organist on her doorstep. What brings you here? Ruth hesitated, then showed her the note. I found this today. I think it might be some horrible joke, but... Alice took the paper with shaking hands, her face draining of color. Where did you get this? It was in an old hymnal, one we haven't used in years. Alice walked to a nearby desk and pulled out a small box. Inside were birthday cards, school assignments, notes, all in Daniel's handwriting. She selected one and placed it beside the mysterious note. The similarity was unmistakable. The distinctive way he formed his D, the slight slant to the right. It's his, Alice whispered. It's my boy's writing. Ruth's world tilted. But that's impossible. It can't be. When did you find it? Alice clutched the note to her chest. Today. In a hymnal that's been in storage for God knows how long. You have to take this to the police, Alice insisted, her eyes suddenly alive with a hope that had been absent for 28 years. Officer Reynolds had retired years ago, replaced by younger officers who viewed the choir boy's case as ancient history. The desk sergeant, a woman in her 30s who hadn't even been born when the boys disappeared, listened to Ruth with poorly disguised skepticism. Ms. Carraway, I understand this must be upsetting, but there's nothing to investigate here. Anyone could have written this note at any time, but the handwriting could be forged, or coincidental, or your memory playing tricks after all these years. The sergeant's voice softened. We all know how this case affected the community. It's natural to look for closure. Ruth left the station fuming. She sat in her car, staring at the note. We're still down here. Down where? The catacombs Father Wendell had dismissed as myth. As she drove home, Ruth passed a man standing outside the police station, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. Something in his posture caught her attention, a kind of coiled intensity as he watched her leave. Next morning, Ruth returned to the cathedral, determined to search for any evidence of hidden spaces beneath the church. She was examining the floor near the altar when a deep voice startled her. Looking for something specific? Ruth turned to find the man from the police station standing in the center aisle, hands in the pockets of a rumpled suit jacket. Who are you? Detective Sean Teller. He showed a badge. Chicago PD until last month. Just transferred here. And you're interested in a 28-year-old cold case? Sean's mouth tightened. Let's just say I have personal reasons for being drawn to missing children cases. Something in his expression stopped Ruth from pressing further. Instead, she showed him the note. I heard about this at the station, he said, examining it carefully. They think you're chasing ghosts. And what do you think? I think 6 kids don't vanish without leaving traces, and I think the Millfield PD's investigation was shoddy at best. He handed the note back. Tell me everything you remember about that day. For the next hour, Ruth recounted every detail of that Sunday in 1980. Daniel's nervousness, Father Wendell's whispered words at communion, the frantic search that followed. And no one ever found any sign of them? Sean asked, making notes. Nothing. It was like they were... Ruth hesitated. Swallowed up by the church itself, Sean finished, looking thoughtfully at the altar. You mentioned catacombs. Old stories. Father Wendell said they were just myths. Churches this old often have secrets. Sean stood up. I'd like to see the original architectural plans. The city records office was housed in a modern building downtown, staffed by a bored-looking clerk who barely looked up from her computer. Architectural plans for St. Godfrey's Cathedral, Sean requested, showing his badge. After 20 minutes of searching, the clerk returned looking confused. That's strange. We should have multiple copies on file, but I can't find any. Just this. Note that the original blueprints were checked out in 1979 and never returned. 1979? Ruth repeated. A year before the boys disappeared. Sean's expression darkened. Who checked them out? The clerk checked her records. A Father Wendell Harrison. The drive back to the cathedral was silent, both lost in thought. As they walked up the steps, Sean finally spoke. Churches like this were often built with secret passages. During Prohibition, some were used to hide liquor. Earlier, they might have been escape routes during religious persecution, or places to hide things people wanted forgotten, Ruth added quietly. Inside, they began a methodical search, focusing on areas that might conceal hidden doors or passages. Hours passed without success until Ruth paused by the old confession booth in the north transept. This doesn't look right, she said, running her hand along the ornate woodwork. The dimensions are off. Sean examined the booth carefully. It's wider on the outside than the inside. He pressed various parts of the carved panels until something clicked, and the back wall of the confessor's side swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. My God, Ruth whispered. Sean pulled out a flashlight. Stay here. Not a chance. Ruth took out her own small flashlight. I've been waiting 28 years for answers. The staircase was steep and narrow, the air growing cold and damp as they descended. The beam of their flashlights revealed stone walls covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. At the bottom, a corridor stretched into darkness. These aren't on any church blueprint I've ever seen, Sean muttered, examining the stonework. These walls are older than the cathedral itself. They moved cautiously forward, the corridor opening into a series of small chambers, some empty, others filled with rotting furniture and moldering books. This looks like living quarters, Ruth said, examining a chamber with a rusted bed frame. And collapsed desk, or hiding places, Sean suggested. The final chamber was larger, circular, with stone walls that bore faded symbols etched in what looked like soot and ash. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark brown. That? Ruth couldn't finish the question. Blood, Sean confirmed grimly. Old blood. Against one wall stood a row of wooden pegs, and hanging from 6 of them were choir robes, white surplices and red cassocks, dusty but unmistakable. Ruth's legs gave way, and she sank to her knees. Oh God, they were here. They were right here, all along. Sean carefully examined the robes without touching them. Evidence, he said quietly. After all these years. In the corner, a faded backpack lay discarded. Sean carefully opened it with a pen, revealing school books and notebooks with "Property of Daniel Matthews" written on the front page. Ruth moved to the wall, where her flashlight beam caught something etched into the stone. Daniel Matthews was here. November 12th, 1980. 3 months after they disappeared, she whispered. They were alive down here for months. Sean's flashlight beam found something else. A rusted metal trap door set into the floor, secured with a heavy padlock that had nearly disintegrated with age. "There's more below," he said, kneeling to examine it. With a hard pull, the lock crumbled, and the trapdoor groaned open, revealing another set of stairs descending even deeper. The staircase led to a smaller chamber with strange acoustics. Sound seemed to echo and amplify, bouncing off the curved walls. 6 stone slabs jutted from the walls like crude beds or altars. Chains with manacles hung from iron rings embedded in the stone. This was some kind of initiation chamber, Sean said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Look at the symbols, carved above each slab." Ruth couldn't speak. Her mind was filled with images of the 6 boys, terrified and alone in this dark place. Had they been sacrificed? Tortured? And by whom? Father Wendell? The bishop? Some secret cult operating within? The church? "Wait," Sean said suddenly, moving to the center of the room. "Look at this." His flashlight illuminated a half-eaten apple on the floor, the exposed flesh barely browned. Beside it lay a flashlight battery, the label clearly readable. "This is recent," he said. "Someone's been down here within the last day or 2. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "We need to call the police." "Agreed. But first..." Sean knelt and picked up something that had been partially buried in the dirt. A small notebook, its pages water-damaged but still legible in parts. The handwriting was cramped and desperate, the words of someone trying to document their experiences despite fear and privation. "They say we've been chosen, special, pure enough for the ritual. Daniel says we should pretend to believe them. It's the only way to stay alive long enough to escape." Ruth read over Sean's shoulder, her heart breaking anew. "They were just children," she whispered. Sean closed the notebook carefully. "We need to preserve this for evidence. Let's go back up and call this in." As they turned to leave, a sound froze them in place, the distinct scrape of the door at the top of the stairs being closed, followed by the heavy thud of a bolt sliding into place. Someone had sealed them in. The darkness seemed to press in around them as the echo of the bolted door faded away. Ruth's breath came in short gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Someone knows we're down here," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the confined space. Sean's expression hardened as he shone his flashlight back toward the staircase. "And they want to keep us here." He reached inside his jacket, pulling out a service weapon. "Stay behind me." They climbed the stairs cautiously, Sean testing each step before allowing Ruth to follow. At the top, he pressed his shoulder against the door, but it didn't budge. "Solid oak," he muttered. "And someone's barricaded it from the outside." Ruth leaned against the cold stone wall, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Who would do this? Who even knows about this place? "Whoever's been coming down here recently," Sean replied, examining the doorframe for weaknesses. "And whoever took those boys in 1980. The implication hung in the air between them. After 28 years, the same people might still be operating within the church. "My phone has no signal," Ruth said, checking the screen. "We're too far underground." Sean holstered his weapon and turned back toward the lower chambers. "We need to find another way out. These old churches often had multiple escape routes." They returned to the circular room with its ominous altar and hanging choir robes. Sean methodically examined every inch of the walls, looking for hidden passages or signs of airflow that might indicate another exit. Ruth moved to the choir robes, her hand hovering near but not touching the dusty fabric. "They were just children," she repeated, a catch in her voice. Sean paused in his search, his expression softening momentarily. "I lost my son last year," he said quietly. "He was 9. Car accident. My wife was driving." He turned back to the wall. That's why I transferred here. Couldn't stay in Chicago with the memories. I'm sorry, Ruth said, understanding now his investment in this case. We'll get out of here, Sean assured her, and we'll find out what happened to those boys. Ruth nodded, forcing herself to focus. She moved to help search the chamber, her flashlight beam skimming across the soot-blackened symbols on the walls. These markings, she said, examining them more closely. They're not random. There's a pattern. Sean joined her, studying the curved lines and strange characters. Some kind of ritual language? No, Ruth realized, tracing one symbol with her finger. It's Latin, but written in a stylized script. This one says purify, and this, she moved to another, says rebirth. You read Latin? 12 years of Catholic school, Ruth explained. Plus, I've been playing church music for 35 years. You pick things up. Sean's flashlight caught something tucked into a crevice in the wall, a small leather-bound book. He carefully extracted it, the spine cracking as he opened it. Some kind of journal, he said, flipping through brittle pages. Dated entries from 1980. He paused at a page, his expression grim. Listen to this. The initiates have been prepared. 5 show promise, but the eldest resists. Perhaps more time in solitude will break his will. Daniel, Ruth whispered. Sean continued reading. Father W. assures me the chamber is soundproof. No one above will hear their prayers or cries. Father W. Father Wendell, Ruth said, her voice hardening. I knew something was wrong that day. Daniel was trying to tell me. Sean flipped to another entry. The ritual requires 6. The number is sacred to the order. We cannot proceed with only 5 willing vessels. Order. What order? Before Sean could answer, a faint sound reached them, a rhythmic tapping from somewhere beyond the chamber. You hear that? Sean asked, closing the journal. Ruth nodded, straining to listen. The tapping continued. 3 quick taps, 3 slow, 3 quick again. SOS, Sean said. Someone's down here with us. They followed the sound to the rusted trapdoor they had opened earlier. The tapping was coming from even deeper below. Hello? Sean called down into the darkness. Is someone there? The tapping stopped, replaced by silence. Then, faintly, a voice. Help! Please! Ruth gasped. There's someone alive down there. Sean descended the stairs first, Ruth close behind. The lower chamber with its stone slabs and manacles opened into a narrow corridor they hadn't noticed before. The tapping resumed, guiding them forward. The corridor ended at a massive metal door, its surface covered in corrosion, but the hinges still intact. A small viewing port was set at eye level, sealed shut from their side. Sean slid the viewer open, revealing only darkness beyond. Hello? He called through the opening. Silence. Then shuffling sounds. A face appeared at the port. Gaunt, bearded, eyes squinting against their flashlight beams. Who are you? The man rasped, his voice thin from Dice Detective Sean Teller, and this is Ruth Carraway. We're here to help. The man's eyes widened at Ruth's name. The Organist? You're still here? After all this time? Ruth stepped closer, peering through the port. Yes. Who are you? How do you know me? The man's cracked lips formed a pained smile. It's me, Ms. Carraway. Daniel Matthews. Ruth staggered back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. Impossible, she whispered. Daniel would be 42, the man finished. I've been counting the days. 28 years, 2 months, and 17 days since they brought us down here. Sean steadied Ruth, then turned back to the port. Daniel, we're going to get you out of there. Is there a key to this door? They keep it upstairs, Daniel replied. In the bishop's office, behind the painting of St. Thomas. They? Sean pressed. Who's been keeping you here? Daniel's eyes darted nervously. The Order of the Red Cloak. They're still active. Still in the church. They'll know you're down here. How many of you are in there? Ruth asked, finding her voice again. Daniel's expression crumpled. Just me now. The others. They didn't survive the first few years. Tommy was the last. Maybe 20 years ago. His voice broke. I've been alone since then. Ruth couldn't process what she was hearing. Daniel, alive after all these years? The other boys dead? It seemed impossible, yet the eyes staring back at her held the same intensity she remembered in the 14-year-old boy from her memories. Why? She asked, the question encompassing everything. Why they were taken, why Daniel was kept alive, why no one had found them. The Order believes in blood sacrifice for spiritual power, Daniel explained, his words coming faster now, as if afraid. They'd leave before hearing everything. They've operated within the church for centuries. We were chosen for our purity. Father Wendell was their leader then. Now it's Bishop Lawrence. The current bishop? Sean asked sharply. Daniel nodded. He was just a junior priest when we were taken, but he rose through the ranks. He brings me food, water, keeps me alive because I'm the last. The final vessel, they call me. For what? Ruth asked. The ultimate ritual, planned for the 30th anniversary of our taking. 2 years from now. Daniel's fingers gripped the edge of the viewing port. You have to get me out before then. Sean examined the door. It's solid metal. We can't break through from this side. And we're locked in ourselves, Ruth added. The organ, Daniel said urgently. My only sense of time down here has been your playing, Ms. Carraway. Every Sunday I hear it. There's a passage that connects to the pipe chamber. The vibrations from the lowest notes can dislodge the old stones in the north wall of the upper chamber. How do you know this? Sean asked. I've had 28 years to study every inch of this prison, Daniel replied. And I've kept records. Everything they've done, everyone involved, it's all documented. Ruth's mind raced. If we can get back to the organ, I might be able to create enough vibration to open another way out. Sean nodded, turning back to Daniel. We'll come back for you, I promise. Hurry, Daniel pleaded. If they find you here, they'll make you disappear too. They retraced their steps to the upper chamber with the altar and choir robes. Sean began examining the north wall, looking for loose stones or hidden mechanisms. If Daniel's right, there should be some kind of connection to the organ pipes, he said, running his hands along the rough surface. Ruth joined him, her fingers probing the ancient mortar between stones. Here, she said suddenly, this section feels different. Sean directed his flashlight where she indicated. The mortar was a slightly different color, newer than the surrounding material. It's been resealed, he confirmed. Recently. Together they began working at the mortar with pocket knives and keys, anything that could chip away at the weakened material. After 20 minutes of effort, a stone shifted slightly. Stand back, Sean warned, before throwing his weight against the loosened stone. With a grinding sound, it gave way, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The pipe chamber, Ruth breathed, peering into the dark tunnel. It must connect to the organ loft. They squeezed through the opening, finding themselves in a dusty vertical shaft, lined with massive wooden and metal pipes. A maintenance ladder ran up one side, disappearing into darkness above. This has to lead to the organ, Ruth said. If we can reach it, we can alert someone outside. As they prepared to climb, a noise from below froze them in place. Voices in the chamber they had just left. They're down here somewhere, a man's voice echoed. The door was open. Seal it again, replied another voice, authoritative and cold. If they've found the lower chamber, they cannot be allowed to leave. Ruth recognized the second voice with a chill. Bishop Lawrence, who had presided over St. Godfrey's for the past 15 years. Sean motioned for silence, then gestured upward. They began climbing as quietly as possible, the voices below growing fainter as they ascended through the forest of pipes. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small maintenance door that opened into the back of the organ loft. Ruth emerged first, relief washing over her as she saw the familiar console of the cathedral organ. We made it, she whispered, as Sean climbed out behind her. The cathedral above was silent and empty, afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. They had been underground for hours. We need to call for help, Sean said, pulling out his phone. And we need evidence. Ruth moved to the organ, her fingers hovering over the keys. Daniel said the vibrations from the lowest notes could dislodge stones in the passage. If I play at full volume, it might cause enough disturbance to reveal more of what's hidden down there. Sean nodded, already dialing. Do it. I'm calling for backup. Ruth pulled out all the stops, setting the organ to its most powerful voice. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play, the same hymn from that Sunday 28 years ago, when 6 innocent boys had vanished without a trace. The cathedral filled with sound, the massive pipes vibrating with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of St. Godfrey's. Deep beneath their feet, secrets buried for decades began to stir, ready at last to rise into the light. D2. Cathedral echoed with wailing sirens as police officers swarmed through St. Godfrey's. Ruth sat wrapped in a shock blanket on the steps of the altar, watching as forensic teams disappeared into the passage behind the confession booth. Sean stood nearby, deep in conversation with the police chief, gesturing emphatically toward the organ loft. 3 hours had passed since Ruth's playing had not only loosened more stones in the hidden passage, but had caused part of the floor near the altar to collapse, revealing another hidden chamber filled with ceremonial objects, robes, daggers, and leather-bound books bearing the symbol of a red cloak. They're bringing Daniel up now, Sean said, returning to Ruth's side. The door was reinforced steel. They had to bring in cutting equipment. Ruth nodded, still processing the reality that Daniel Matthews, one of the 6 boys she had mourned for 28 years, was alive. What about the others? Sean's expression darkened. We found remains in the lower chambers. They'll need DNA testing, but it's them, Ruth finished quietly. The other 5 boys. Before Sean could respond, a commotion at the entrance to the passage drew their attention. Paramedics emerged, carefully guiding a stretcher that carried a frail figure. Though gaunt and pale, with a wild gray-streaked beard and hollow cheeks, there was something unmistakably familiar in the man's intense eyes. Daniel, Ruth whispered, rising to her feet. Daniel's head turned at the sound of her voice, his cracked lips forming a tentative smile. Ms. Carraway, your music, it saved me. Ruth approached the stretcher, tears welling in her eyes. I never stopped playing. Every Sunday. I know, Daniel replied weakly. It was the only way I kept track of time. The only thing that kept me sane. As the paramedics prepared to transport him to the hospital, Daniel grasped Ruth's hand with surprising strength. The bishop. You have to stop him. The journals. We found them, Sean assured him, stepping forward. Everything you documented, it's safe. Daniel's body relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained urgent. There are others, not just in this church. The order has branches everywhere. We'll find them all, Sean promised. You have my word. As Daniel was wheeled away, Ruth turned to Sean. What happens now? Now we hunt down every member of this order, Sean replied grimly, starting with Bishop Lawrence. The following morning found Ruth and Sean at the local monastery archives, housed in a modest stone building on the outskirts of town. Brother Thomas, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, led them through rows of ancient tomes and documents. Most of these records date back to the founding of St. Godfrey's in the 1890s, he explained. But some are even older, transferred from European monasteries. We're looking for any reference to a group called Sanguis Nativitas, Sean said, showing the monk a symbol they had found in the underground chamber, a stylized chalice beneath a red cloak. Brother Thomas's face paled. Where did you find this? You recognize it? Ruth asked sharply. The monk hesitated, then nodded. It's not spoken of openly, but stories persist. Blood of the Innocents, a splinter group that broke from the church centuries ago but continued to operate within its walls. There were rumors even when I was a novice, but nothing concrete. Until now, Sean said grimly. Brother Thomas led them to a locked cabinet in the rear of the archives. These are restricted documents, but under the circumstances, he unlocked the cabinet and withdrew a leather portfolio. This contains correspondence between the Vatican and various American dioceses in the 1950s, when there was an internal investigation into certain irregular practices. The portfolio contained dozens of letters, reports, and photographs. One image in particular caught Ruth's attention, a church procession from 1980, showing clergy in traditional vestments, but among them, a figure in a red robe that matched no known clerical garb. "That's the Easter procession," Ruth said, examining the photo closely. "Just months before the boys disappeared." Sean pointed to the red-robed figure. "And that's Father Wendell, isn't it?" Ruth nodded, her stomach clenching. He was leading the choir boys that day. They continued through the documents, piecing together a disturbing history. The Order of the Red Cloak had operated for centuries, positioning members in churches across Europe and later America. Their beliefs centered around blood sacrifice and ritualistic purification of chosen individuals, usually children, who would serve as vessels for spiritual power. "According to this," Sean said, reading from a confidential report, "the Vatican suspected their presence but could never prove it. They operated like ghosts within the church." "But why children?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking. "Why those 6 boys?" Brother Thomas looked away, his expression pained. "The order believes in the power of innocence. The purer the vessel, the more powerful the ritual." As Sean photographed key documents with his phone, Ruth discovered a folder containing transfer records for priests within the diocese. "Look at this," she said. "Father Wendell wasn't sent to Europe as everyone believed. He was transferred to a private retreat in northern Maine, a property owned by a St. Raphael's Trust." Sean quickly searched the name on his phone. St. Raphael's Trust, still active today, and guess who's on the board of directors? Bishop Lawrence, Ruth guessed. Sean nodded grimly. "Along with 3 other bishops from neighboring dioceses. They left the monastery with copies of key documents, their car speeding back toward Millfield. As they drove, Sean made calls to secure search warrants for the bishop's residence and office. "The DA is on board," he told Ruth. "What we found in those chambers is enough for multiple warrants. They're moving on the bishop's home now." "He won't be there," Ruth said with certainty. "He'll be at the hospital." "Why the hospital?" "Daniel," Ruth realized with sudden clarity. "He's the last living witness, the only one who can identify every member of the order." Sean's face hardened as he made a sharp U-turn, heading toward Millfield General Hospital. "Call it in," he instructed, tossing his phone to Ruth. "Tell them to secure Daniel's room immediately." Ruth's fingers trembled as she dialed. Before she could complete the call, her own phone rang. An unknown number. "Caraway," said a familiar voice when she answered. "I believe we need to talk." "Bishop Lawrence," Ruth replied, putting the call on speaker for Sean to hear. "I understand you've been quite busy," the bishop continued, his tone unnervingly calm. "Digging into matters that don't concern you." "Where are you?" Ruth demanded. "Somewhere. Safe, unlike your friend Daniel." A pause. "He's quite fragile, you know, after so many years underground. It would be a shame if his recovery were..." Interrupted, Sean grabbed the phone. "Listen to me very carefully, Lawrence. If anything happens to Daniel Matthews, I will personally ensure you never see daylight again." The bishop chuckled. "Detective, teller, so protective of a man you just met, perhaps because he reminds you of your own loss. How is Sarah, by the way? Still blaming herself for little Jack's accident?" Sean's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel. "How do you know about my family?" "The order knows many things, detective. We have eyes and ears everywhere." The bishop's voice hardened. "Including in Daniel's hospital room." The call disconnected as Sean floored the accelerator, the car racing through the streets of Millfield toward the hospital. They arrived to find chaos, police officers surrounding the building, medical staff being evacuated. Sean flashed his badge, pushing through the crowd to the officer in charge. "What happened?" he demanded. "Someone pulled the fire alarm," the officer explained. "During the evacuation, there was an incident on the 3rd floor. That's where your witness was being kept." Ruth's heart sank. "Is he..." "He's alive," the officer assured them. "But he's missing. Security cameras show a man in an orderly's uniform wheeling him out through a service entrance." "The bishop," Sean growled. "No sign of him," the officer replied. "But we found this." He handed Sean a folded note. Sean read it aloud. The ritual requires the final vessel. The 30th anniversary approaches. Sanguis nativitas. Ruth felt a cold dread settle over her. They're going to complete what they started 30 years ago. Not if we find them first, Sean vowed, as they stood contemplating their next move. Ruth's phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Play the hymn. I'll hear you. Ruth's fingers hovered over the organ keys, her eyes closed in concentration. The cathedral stood empty save for Sean and a tactical team positioned discreetly throughout the vast space. 3 days had passed since Daniel's abduction from the hospital with no sign of him or Bishop Lawrence despite a nationwide manhunt. Are you sure about this? Sean asked softly, standing beside the organ console. Ruth nodded. Daniel said he could hear my playing from his prison. If he's anywhere near the cathedral, this might reach him. And draw out the order, Sean added. Which is why we're ready. He touched the weapon holstered under his jacket. Ruth began to play, not just any hymn, but the specific piece from that Sunday in 1980, the last time the 6 boys had been seen above ground. The powerful notes reverberated through the cathedral, reaching into every corner, every hidden space. After completing the hymn, Ruth paused, the final chord hanging in the air. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Then, faintly at first, but growing stronger, a tapping sound emanated from beneath the altar. Morse code, Sean whispered, moving quickly toward the sound. SOS. Then, he listened intently. Coordinates. Ruth joined him at the altar as Sean radioed the code to his team. It's latitude and longitude, he explained, about 20 miles from here. Within the hour, a convoy of police vehicles streaked through the countryside, heading toward an isolated property registered to St. Raphael's Trust. Satellite images showed a compound centered around a small stone chapel, surrounded by woods. They've owned this property since 1972, Sean told Ruth as they approached in an unmarked car. Tax records show it as a spiritual retreat center, but there's no public record of anyone ever using it. The perfect hiding place, Ruth murmured. SWAT teams surrounded the compound while Sean and Ruth remained in the command vehicle, watching thermal imaging screens that showed heat signatures inside the chapel. Multiple subjects, the SWAT commander reported. One stationary in what appears to be the basement level. The others are moving around the main floor. That has to be Daniel, Sean said. Proceed with extreme caution. These people are dangerous and likely armed. The raid unfolded with military precision, SWAT officers breaching multiple entry points simultaneously, flashbangs disorienting those inside. Within minutes, the commander's voice crackled over the radio. Building secure. Multiple suspects in custody. We've located the hostage. Ruth and Sean rushed forward, passing handcuffed figures in civilian clothes, men and women, of various ages, some wearing expressions of defiance, others of defeat. Inside the chapel, officers were escorting a final figure from the basement, Bishop Lawrence, his clerical collar askew, his face a mask of cold hatred. This isn't over, he hissed as he passed Sean. The order has endured for centuries. It will survive this too. Not if I have anything to say about it, Sean replied, watching as the bishop was led away. In the basement, they found Daniel lying on a stone altar, surrounded by ritual implements and candles. Though weak, he was conscious, his eyes lighting, up at the sight of Ruth. I knew you'd understand my message, he said as paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher. I could hear your music in my head. After all these years, it's still the clearest sound I know. Later, in the safety of a guarded hospital room, Daniel was able to speak more freely, his strength gradually returning with proper care and nourishment. They were preparing me for the final ritual, he explained, his voice steadier than before. 30 years to the day after we were taken. That was always their plan. Why keep you alive all this time? Sean asked gently. Daniel's eyes clouded with painful memories. The ritual required one survivor, the final vessel who had absorbed the suffering of all the others. He swallowed hard. They made me watch as each of my friends died. Tommy, Michael, the twins, Andrew. one by one, over the years. Ruth took his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. We should have found you sooner." "You never stopped looking," Daniel said softly. "Even when everyone else gave up, you kept playing. You kept the connection alive." Sean cleared his throat, emotion threatening to overcome his professional demeanor. "We need to know everything, Daniel. Every name, every location. We have to dismantle this organization completely." Daniel nodded gravely. "I've kept records. For 28 years, I documented everything, names, dates, rituals. It was the only way I could stay sane, to think that someday someone would find the truth." He paused. "The bishop had my journals, but I memorized everything in them." Over the following days, Daniel worked with investigators, identifying dozens of order members across the country and beyond. His testimony, combined with evidence from the underground chambers in the chapel compound, led to a wave of arrests. Priests, community leaders, even a judge and a congressman were implicated. Ruth visited daily, often bringing Sean with her. They formed an unlikely trio: the aging organist, the haunted detective, and the man who had survived decades of unimaginable horror. Slowly, Daniel began to reacclimatize to the world, though the process was fraught with challenges. "The light hurts my eyes," he admitted one afternoon as Ruth opened the blinds in his room. "After so many years in darkness, everything seems too bright, too loud." "It will get easier," Ruth assured him, adjusting the blinds to a more comfortable level. "One day at a time." Sean arrived with news that the bishop and Father Wendell, found living under an assumed name in the compound, had both been denied bail. "The prosecution is building an airtight case," he reported. "With your testimony, Daniel, they'll never see freedom again." Daniel nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "There's something I haven't told you," he said quietly. "Something about the other boys." Ruth and Sean exchanged glances, then pulled chairs closer to his bed. "In the early years, we tried to escape many times," Daniel began, his voice distant as if recalling a dream. "Once, Andrew almost made it to the surface, but they caught him and—" He shook his head. "After that, they separated us. But we could still communicate through the walls, tapping messages like I did to you." "You kept each other going," Sean said softly. "Yes, but there's more." Daniel's eyes met Ruth's. "The hymns you played every Sunday, the boys could hear them too. It became our calendar, our connection to the world above. Even as they grew weaker, the music gave them hope." Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. "All those years. They heard me?" Daniel nodded. "Tommy was the last, besides me. Before he died, he made me promise that if I ever got out, I'd tell you that your music kept their spirits alive even when their bodies failed." His voice broke. They never lost faith that someone was looking for them. The room fell silent save for the quiet sobs that escaped Ruth's control. Sean placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his own eyes damp. "You didn't just save me," Daniel said finally. "You saved all of us in the only way that mattered. You kept us human." Autumn leaves swirled around the steps of the courthouse as Daniel Matthews emerged into sunlight, flanked by Ruth and Sean. 6 months had passed since his rescue. Months filled with medical treatments, therapy, depositions, and finally, the trial that had captured national attention. Bishop Lawrence and 12 other order members had been convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder. Father Wendell had died in custody, taking many secrets to his grave. But the investigation continued, with Daniel's testimony helping to uncover order cells in 3 other states. "It's over," Sean said, guiding Daniel through the crowd of reporters who clamored for statements. "They can't hurt anyone else." Daniel nodded, his appearance dramatically transformed from the emaciated prisoner they had rescued. Though still thin, his beard was now neatly trimmed, his hair cut short, and he wore a simple suit donated by a local business. Most striking was the change in his eyes, still haunted, but now holding something that looked almost like peace. "What will you do now?" Ruth asked as they drove away from the courthouse. Daniel gazed out the window at the world he was still relearning. I've been offered a book deal. The sanctuary below, my story, and the story of the other boys. I think I owe it to them to tell it. That's brave, Sean commented. It won't be easy to relive. I've been reliving it every day for 28 years, Daniel replied simply. At least now it might help others. There are still victims out there, children who disappeared and were never found. Maybe this will bring some answers. They drove, in silence for a while, passing through a town that had changed dramatically since Daniel had last seen it as a 14-year-old boy. Eventually, they turned onto the road leading to St. Godfrey's Cathedral, which stood silent and empty. Police, tape still visible around its perimeter. The diocese is closing it permanently, Ruth explained as they parked nearby. After everything that happened, they couldn't justify keeping it open. Daniel stared up at the imposing stone facade. I never thought I'd see it from the outside. Again. You don't have to go in, Sean said gently. No one would blame you. I need to, Daniel insisted. For closure. For the others. Inside, the cathedral was a shadow of its former grandeur. Pews stood empty, dust gathering on surfaces once polished to a shine. The altar had been partially dismantled, the underground chambers sealed with concrete. After all evidence had been collected. Daniel moved slowly through the space, his fingers trailing along familiar surfaces. The choir stalls where he and his friends had sat, the steps where they had stood for that final photograph. Finally, he approached the organ loft where Ruth had faithfully played every Sunday for decades. Would you? He asked, gesturing to the instrument. One last time. Ruth hesitated, then nodded. The electricity's still connected. They're not deconsecrating the building until next month. She took her place at the console, adjusting the bench with the familiarity of long habit. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before beginning the hymn. The same one from that Sunday in 1980. The same one she had played to help Sean and Daniel communicate after his abduction. The music filled the empty cathedral, echoing from stone walls that had witnessed both profound faith and unspeakable evil. Daniel closed his eyes, allowing the sound to wash over him. Beside him, Sean stood in respectful silence, his own demons momentarily quieted by the soaring notes. When the final chord faded, Daniel opened his eyes. Thank you, he said simply, for never stopping. Ruth smiled through tears. I always hoped you'd come back, all of you. In a way we have, Daniel replied, through me, through the truth finally being told. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused at the choir stalls one last time, running his hand along the smooth wood. I have one more request, he said. The memorial for the boys. I'd like to help design it. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, a small crowd gathered in what had once been the cathedral grounds. The building itself was gone, carefully dismantled stone by stone. In its place stood a simple garden with 5 stone markers arranged in a semicircle, each bearing the name of one of the lost boys. In the center stood a sculpture of 6 children, hands joined, faces turned upward toward the sky. Daniel, now working as a consultant for organizations that searched for missing children, stood beside Ruth and Sean as the memorial was dedicated. Alice Matthews, Daniel's mother, held his hand tightly, still marveling at the miracle of her son's return. Today we remember Michael Winters, Tommy Walker, James and Robert Parker, and Andrew Davis, the speaker said. Children whose voices were silenced too soon, but whose legacy will help protect others from similar fates. As the ceremony concluded, Daniel stepped forward to lay white roses on each of the 5 markers. Then he turned to address the gathered, families, supporters, and media. We were children who loved to sing, he began, his voice steady and clear. We were the voices of angels in this place, and even in darkness, we never stopped singing. He paused, emotion briefly overtaking him. Because of what happened here, 27 other victims of the order have been found across the country. Some alive, many not, but all now accounted for, all now known and honored. Ruth watched from the sidelines, her heart full. Though she no longer played the organ professionally, she had found a new purpose, working alongside Sean, whose transfer to Millfield had become permanent, in a foundation established to support survivors of abduction and imprisonment. As the crowd dispersed, Daniel approached her, a small package in his hand. "I wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to her. Inside was a journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "I started a new one," Daniel explained, "after I was rescued. This one doesn't document horror, it documents healing." Ruth opened it carefully, finding entries that chronicled Daniel's journey back to life. His first time seeing stars again, feeling rain on his face, hearing music that wasn't muffled through stone walls. "The last entry is about today," he said. "About how the music never really stopped, even when everything else was taken away." Ruth embraced him, this man who had been the boy she failed to save, yet somehow had saved himself, and through his survival, had saved countless others. As they walked away from the memorial garden, Sean joining them with a supportive hand on Daniel's shoulder, Ruth glanced back at the sculpture of the 6 boys. In the bright sunlight, their stone faces seemed almost alive, frozen in a moment of joy that existed before darkness fell. But it was the real, living Daniel beside her who spoke the words that would stay with her forever. "We were the voices of angels, and still we sang, even in the dark." What would you sacrifice to uncover buried truths? And how many souls lie waiting beneath places we consider sacred? If this story chilled you to the bone, like and subscribe for more tales that will keep you awake long after the final note fades.